Welcome, Age of Vintage Society. Over 60 years have passed since Carmen Miranda's tragic, untimely death at the age of 46, but the so-called Brazilian bombshell's iconic image continues reverberating through our cultural memory to this day. What makes Carmen Miranda so controversial? Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. From her expressive eyes and vibrant smile to her larger-than-life tropical fruit-inspired outfits, Miranda's legacy persists in everything from fashion and design to the instantly recognisable Chiquita Banana logo inspired by her image. But few are familiar with the long and winding road that brought the native of a small town in northern Portugal to the biggest stages and screens the world had to offer. Born in 1909, Miranda first arrived in Brazil when she was only a year old, and though she never returned to the country of her birth, she retained her Portuguese nationality throughout her life. The future superstar had extremely humble roots. The second daughter of José Pinto da Cunha and his wife Maria, Miranda's family from firm working-class stock, and growing up the little girl could only dream of bright lights and big cities. Though her birth name was Maria, her father christened her Carmen, after George Bizet's incredibly popular opera of the same name. Miranda's dad was a great lover of opera music, and he wanted to pass off some of its grandeur onto his own daughter. The Miranda family's life in Brazil started out full of hope, but things soon took a cruel turn. When Miranda was 14 years old, her older sister Olinda became gravely ill with tuberculosis. It got so bad that the family even had to send her back to Portugal to recover, and Carmen needed to take up work in a tie shop to help pay the medical bills. After discovering her singing talents, young Carmen nursed ambitions of becoming a huge star and started performing at festivals around Rio de Janeiro. However, her strict Catholic father was staunchly opposed to his daughter flaunting herself. When she entered a radio competition, his response was so disturbing it's impossible to forget. José da Cunha reached a breaking point, and instead of punishing Carmen, he punished her mother. Maria had always been supportive of Carmen's dreams, so José took it out on her in a brutal way, beating her after catching wind of the competition. Miranda's work in a tie shop helped her get a career in retail, and this led to even better prospects. She eventually got a job in a boutique where she learned how to make hats. Obviously, this apprenticeship ended up serving her well later on with her famous fruit basket hats. When Miranda was barely 20 years old, she met the composer José de Barros while working at her family's inn. He changed her life forever. Seeing her obvious talent and singing chops, de Barros invited her to record with him and Brunswick Records. Before she became a star on Broadway and Hollywood, Miranda was big in Brazil. Her rise coincided with the beginning of the country's music industry. Yet it was her 1930 recording of the song Te Eu Fiz Tudo para Você Gostar de Mim, written by Hubert de Carvalho, that catapulted her to national stardom and cemented her status as the premier interpreter of the increasingly popular samba genre. She was the most successful Brazilian singer in Brazil for 10 years before she ever went to America, and so she was very important to Brazilian music, to Brazilian radio. In fact, during that period, Miranda cut more records than anyone else. Throughout the 1930s, she performed on Brazilian radio stations and appeared in a handful of early Brazilian sound films called chanchadas, which celebrated Brazilian music, dance, and carnival culture. Her features embodied the spirit of these early Miranda films, though it was the 1939 musical Banana da Terra, directed by Rui Costa, that brought the world her iconic Baiana image, inspired by the wardrobe of poor Afro-descendants from the northeastern state of Bahia. Later that year, Broadway producer Lee Schubert caught sight of Miranda's stage show at one of Rio's famous casinos, and invited her to perform in the Broadway revue The Streets of Paris later that year. After arriving in New York with some members of her backup band, Bando da Lua, Miranda quickly became a Broadway sensation and earned glowing reviews from the US's most important critics. Success on the stage quickly led to a movie contract with 20th Century Fox, and the birth of Carmen Miranda's enduring Hollywood legend came in the form of the 1940 Technicolor musical Down Argentine Way, directed by Lee Cummings. In Brazil, instead of celebrating her success, the exact opposite happened. People jeered at her and said she was a sellout. When she came back to Brazil the next year, she had a very bad experience at the Casino da Urca. She really was very upset and she cried. She stopped the show. After that experience, Miranda didn't come back to Brazil for 14 years, but she got the last word. She recorded a song about the incident. They say I came back Americanized. Throughout this time, Miranda emerged as a symbol of strengthening diplomatic ties between the United States and Brazil, built as much around the US war effort and Franklin Roosevelt's strategic good neighbor policy as Brazil's desire for dominance in the North American coffee market. As part of these diplomatic overtures, Brazilian President Getulio Vargas went so far as to pay the passage of Miranda's band members on their initial voyage to New York, and soon after her arrival, Miranda was introduced to Roosevelt at a White House banquet. Yet the Latin American roles Miranda pioneered in the wartime film industry generally had very little to do with the cultural specificities of Brazil, and usually amounted to a hodgepodge of stereotypical elements of Brazilian, Mexican, Cuban and Argentine culture. This was epitomized in films like Down Argentine Way, which was ultimately banned from Argentina for its insulting and inauthentic portrayal of Argentina. To boot, Miranda's exotic wardrobe became increasingly exaggerated and over the top with each film, culminating with director Busby Berkeley's 1943 musical The Gang's All Here, in which Miranda's fruit hat reached new, massive proportions. As the highest-paid actress in Hollywood in the mid-1940s, Miranda introduced the US to an entirely new look, inspired by the outfits worn by Afro-Brazilian female street vendors in colonial times. These baianãs wore lace tops, gold jewellery and simple cloth turbans, and carried trays of fruit and other produce on their heads. This is how Miranda described them when she wore her Baiana-inspired outfit for the first time. In her stylized version, Carmen added sequins and a small imitation basket of fruit to her turban, which was made of lame fabric. Her name has become synonymous with frilly blouses and plastic fruit accessories, but did you know that the actor was also credited with popularizing the platform shoe? In 1934, when Miranda was a samba singer in Brazil, she commissioned an orthopedic cobbler in Rio de Janeiro to make thick-soled shoes to boost her height. She was just 5 foot tall. At around the same time, Moshe Kimmel would design a pair of platforms for Marlene Dietrich that later became known as the first official platforms. But the towering shoes were always essential to Miranda's larger-than-life look. Her influence on fashion had broader consequences too. The colourful aesthetic that made her a hit in Hollywood was controversial back home in Brazil. American audiences first became aware of her aesthetic the same year, when Miranda left Rio for New York to perform in the Broadway production Streets of Paris. On the eve of her departure, she announced, "I am taking 6 really fancy Baiana costumes with me. I asked them to pull out all the stops when designing them." Her stage costumes became an overnight sensation, earning the diminutive singer a series of product endorsements for costume jewellery, ready-to-wear turbans, blouses and platform shoes, stocked by the main Manhattan department stores. In fact, the Bonwit Telestore even created mannequins with faces and poses copied directly from Miranda's for their window displays. Now not only was Miranda dressing in the Baiana look, so too were the affluent customers of Bergdorf Goodman and Macy's. The adoption by Brazil's most famous female star of such a racially marked persona, traditionally associated with poor black women, was not without controversy. It shocked many in Brazil, who thought it inappropriate behaviour for a white woman, who was actually born in Portugal but now performed in elite venues in Rio. But at the time, Afro-Brazilian popular culture, and samba music in particular, was also being appropriated by the regime of the Brazilian president, as part of a wider policy aimed at creating a sense of national identity that embraced a hitherto marginalised black population. From the president's perspective, Miranda's look was a hit and had his official seal of approval. In Brazil until the late 1930s, Miranda was known for a distinctly Hollywood-inspired fashion sense. Her previous film costumes included the full-length white organza dress with wide frilly sleeves that she made for herself to wear in the 1935 Brazilian musical. Her appearance highly reminiscent of one of the iconic gowns designed by Adrian for Joan Crawford in the 1932 Hollywood movie Letty Linton. And the lame trousers, tuxedo and top hat she wore in Allo Allo Carnaval in 1936, similar to those worn by Marlene Dietrich. Her creation of this persona helped her to become a superstar, her popularity booming alongside a surging US interest in samba music and Brazilian culture, but it became a double-edged sword. Under the contract with 20th Century Fox between 1940 and 1946, Miranda was forced to play stereotypical roles as fiery-tempered Latin American women who spoke comically fractured English and wore increasingly garish adaptations of the Baiana costume, complete with ludicrously decorated turbans. This cultural straitjacket continued to dominate her screen performances, even when she went on to work with other studios. In 1947, to achieve more creative freedom in a film she was making, Carmen decided to produce her own film. It was called Copacabana, and she played opposite Groucho Marx. The budget was divided into around 10 sponsors' quotas. A Texan investor, who held one of the quotas, sent his brother David Sebastian to keep an eye on Carmen and look after his interests on the film set. His position allowed him to get close to Carmen, and they started to date. On 17th of March 1947, Miranda married Sebastian. In 1948 she became pregnant, but suffered a miscarriage after a show. The marriage only lasted a few months, but Carmen, who was Catholic, would not accept getting a divorce. Her sister, Aurora Miranda, later would state in the documentary Bananas Is My Business that he was very rude, many times even hit her. The marriage was a burden in her life. He only married her for her money. He did not like our family. In September 1949, the couple announced their separation, but they later reconciled. Before leaving for the United States and before meeting her husband, Carmen had a relationship with the young Mario Cunha and bon vivant Carlos da Rocha Faria, son of a traditional family of Rio de Janeiro, and also the musician Aloisio de Oliveira, one of the Bando da Lua members. In the US, she maintained relationships with the Mexican Arturo da Cordova, Dana Andrews, Harold Young and John Wayne, and the Brazilian Carlos Niemeyer. In her later years, in addition to her already heavy smoking and alcohol consumption, Miranda began taking amphetamines and barbiturates, all of which took a toll on her health. On 4th of August 1955, Miranda suffered a fatal heart attack at her home in Beverly Hills. Her death was officially reported as a heart attack, but it was later revealed that the 46-year-old star was pregnant and died of preeclampsia, a pregnancy-related condition characterized by high blood pressure and kidney malfunction. Today, many Brazilians have mixed feelings about the image of Brazil that Miranda took to the wider world, yet Miranda's enduring cultural legacy is undeniably a testament to her creativity and aesthetic nous. As her Hollywood career took flight in the 1940s and 50s, homages by the likes of Judy Garland and Barbara Stanwyck and a host of comic impersonations, often cross-dressed, caricatures and cartoon likenesses of Miranda's look cemented her image among the public, key for commercial exploitation. Even now, echoes of Miranda's tropical, exotic Latin look abound in advertising and in women's wear, with fashion journalists and marketing teams perennially alluding to the Brazilian star to describe subtle reworkings of her signature look in the form of frills, oversized costume jewellery, platform shoes and turbans. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the life and legacy of Carmen Miranda? Her Hollywood image was one of a generic Latiness that blurred the distinctions between Brazil, Portugal, Argentina and Mexico, as well as between samba, tango and habanera.